71st commemoration of Kristallnacht. And at this point, I want to introduce the head of the school, Rowena Sharowski.
Good evening, everyone. Before we get started with the evening, just very brief remarks. But I first want to acknowledge and thank Harry Uvegi, who as chair of the Holocaust Commemoration Committee. That's really I know of no other committee that is as committed, devoted, and thoughtful about what they do. And certainly tonight's program, as you can see, is slightly different from what we've done in the past. And when I was thinking about the values of the Heschel School, how we are always aiming to balance the particular and the universal. And yet I think that if you think about what the Heschel School really is, the universal certainly emanates from the particular. And so I think that tonight's program is really an expression of that, and I am most eager to get started with it. So I do want to acknowledge, to welcome each of you warmly. I see some of you I haven't seen in a long time, and it's lovely to see you. But particularly, I want to welcome graduates who are here this evening. It is so nice to see you here. And you really speak to what the Heschel School is about. And so really welcome and come back often. I also want to acknowledge the Heschel Harmonizers who will start the program right after you speak, Harry. And they are under the able leadership of the Dean of Horn. So you will have an opportunity in a few minutes to hear from them. And I think it's what that we can see. And thank you for being here. And Harry, please.
Thank you, Rowena. I'd like to acknowledge the committee that has been responsible for these events over the past 12 years, and also acknowledge one of the first chairpersons of this committee. Dina is here this evening, and I would like to thank her for being here. Sitting in the last row so that nobody would know that she's here. In addition to that, Dina so wonderfully has brought with her some of her students who are in the middle of the process of wanting to understand better Holocaust survivorship, genocide, and the relationships that may become visible based on the studies that they do. And we welcome those students who are here this evening to gain greater knowledge of what we will hear this evening as well. I also would like to thank Suzanne Weinstein, who has been the key factor in making this event happen and has worked so hard to make a lot of the details come to fruition. Thank you, Suzanne. We have embarked on a project to enable all of our historical references, both from the collection of archives and stories that we have collected over the years from members of our community, grandparents who have survived, that have told their story in analog form. And we have begun the process with the full support of Rowena and Linda Holub-Sepash to gain access to the school's new technology and their website. And if you recall, the invitation gave you a link into the website that gave us a greater detail of the speakers' bios. And at the same time, layered behind that, will begin to appear the videos of all of our stories from the speakers that have presented in the past, as well as the analog archives that are now being translated digitally. And we'll be there for the students of the Heschel School, from the lower grades to the middle school through the high school, for them to access through their teachers the idea of being able to gain a more personal view of who might be sitting next to you, who would have written that story, would have been part of that story. And that has been the focus of the Heschel Holocaust Remembrance Archive, and a lot of the digital work is in the hands of David Froben. Thank you, David. Before David, we had to have it done analog, and the history and the beginning of that, we'd like to thank Trudy Gottesman for. And Marilyn. I saw Marilyn, but I don't see her now. There you are. Thank you, Marilyn. There is another committee that is responsible for taking each item that we receive from an important educational standpoint and begin to liaison that to the school curriculum and the staff of the school. And we thank Eva Fogelman for pioneering that portion of that work. Thank you, Eva. We welcome any parent in the school to become part of any one of those subcommittees, because it's a long, daunting task of being able to put this together. The window of opportunity is slowly fading, and we really want to have that in place so that we truly leave a legacy for our children and grandchildren, the opportunity to know the full story, all the perspectives associated with the stories, and we will have something to truly remember all of our efforts by. With that, I would like to just give you a brief overview of tonight's event, and then we will be listening to the pillars of vital voices, the voices that bring to us the echo of the distant past, which is 70 years and shorter, and as recent as 15 years ago, with a follow-up of a dream that happened 3 years ago, and how we bridge the history of humankind from the different perspectives, and how individuals are here to tell a story, and how there are people who are here to change the story to a profound moment and shift in how we could make possibly the future be a lot better than what we're about to hear. Before we do that, I'd like to invite the Heschel Harmonizers into the room to give us that sound that invites us to the next level. Thank you.
Tonight we will sing Hatikvah, the state of Israel's national anthem. Hatikvah literally means the hope, and the song conveys the Jewish people's faith that, in the long run, hope will prevail. Through times of great fear and destruction, our ancestors kept the light of hope alive, and tonight we will continue with that tradition of Hatikvah. Please stand silently for a moment.
about 71 years ago. We've come a long way since then, and we also continue to pray and hope for peace, love, and community within the Jewish people and the world.
land, although that is my claim to fame. I'm actually here in my capacity as the founder of the Agahozo Shalom Youth Village in Rwanda, which you will be hearing a little bit more about soon. My co-speakers this evening are David Gowitzman, and I have to say it's an honor to really be here with both of you. So thank you for joining us this evening. David was born in Loszice in Poland in 1928. In 1939, when his town was occupied by the Germans, he was confined with other Jews to the ghetto, and this is where he celebrated his bar mitzvah in 1941. In 1942, when the German and Polish police forced the Jews on a death march destined for Treblinka, David and his family went into hiding, first in an attic and then in a pigsty, where they hid until they were liberated by the Russians in 1944. Of the 800,000 Jews in the Loszice ghetto, 16 survived. David reached the United States by Italy in 1948, where he earned a degree in pharmacy, got married, and was drafted into the United States Army, where he served in Germany. He became a pharmacist, had 2 children, 6 grandchildren, but also became an activist, telling his story and that of his family to the world, in the hope that it would prevent these terrible events from happening again. David is very active on the board of the National Holocaust Memorial Center in Glen Cove, New York, and it's really a pleasure to have you here with us this evening. Jacqueline Mercatelli is a survivor of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. Her entire family was murdered during the genocide, and she was left alone at age 9. Jacqueline was brought to an orphanage and later adopted by an uncle on Long Island. In high school at age 16, she heard David Gowitzman speak about the Holocaust, and after doing so, she too was determined to try and make a difference in the world. And she has. Wherever she has had the opportunity, she has spoken up against genocide, most recently as a fellow for the New York-based not-for-profit Miracle Corners of the World, where she serves as the director of Jacqueline's Human Rights Corner. She graduated with honors from NYU in 2006 and is now a full-time law student at Yeshiva University's Cardozo School of Law. Having once been a law student, I know how time-consuming that is, and so I really appreciate you being with us tonight. Thank you, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you,
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Anne, for such a wonderful introduction. It's an honor, it's a privilege for David and I to be here tonight. And it's especially an honor because we realize the importance of tonight. And I'm privileged to be able to be here with you as we commemorate Kristallnacht and as we remember the millions of men, women, and children who lost their lives during the Holocaust. I will be invited, as you heard from Anne, to speak briefly, to talk to you briefly about what happened in Rwanda in 1994. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the genocide in Rwanda to some extent. But I will speak about it in general, and then I will briefly share my own experience as a child during that genocide which took place about 15 years ago. We all know that after the Holocaust, the international community said never again. This is a phrase that we've been hearing since the Holocaust. It's a phrase that we're still hearing even today. But unfortunately for us, the crime of genocide is not something that ended with the Holocaust. It's something that has continued throughout time, as we're all too well aware. And at the end of the day, what happened in Rwanda in 1994 was not unique to Rwanda. After the Holocaust, we all know about what took place in places like Cambodia, in Bosnia, and since Rwanda, even today in Darfur, Sudan. So that even today, in the 21st century, I always say that it's unfortunate that the genocide as a crime remains, in my opinion, one of the worst crimes, one of the worst threats facing us as humanity.
And my role, what I see my role as a survivor is to try and share my experience, not because I enjoy it, as you can imagine, having to relive, to retell the horrors that I and many others experience, but because I hope, David and I hope that by sharing our experiences with an audience such as this, we can move people to be active in genocide prevention, to speak out about the various things that enable genocide to happen, to speak out against racism, to speak out against anti-Semitism, to speak out about discrimination of all types and forms. So it is for that reason that David and I and the other survivors who speak. It is because we want to make sure that hopefully one day we can live in a world where no other child, no other person will ever have to experience the horrors that we experience or suffer the loss that we suffered. The genocide in 1994 it's something that I always say that I can't take a day, or a week, or even a month, or even a year trying to explain. Because the 1994 genocide is something that resulted, or that came about as a result of many years, many decades of a history of violence in Rwanda, a history of ethnic discrimination, a history that went back as far as colonial times, when first the Germans and then the Belgians came to Rwanda and began a campaign of dividing Rwandans on basis of ethnicity. So that when I was born in Rwanda in 1984, I was born in a country that was very much ethnically based. We had an ID system. It was an ID system that was introduced in Rwanda by Belgians. So that in Rwanda, when you were born, on your birth certificate, in addition to listing your name and your sex and the day of your birth, your ethnicity was also listed. So at a very young age, all of us as Rwandans, we knew that we were not just human beings, that we were not just Rwandans, but that we were either Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. And all those words had connotations, they had meanings. For those of us who were born as members of Tutsi ethnic group, we knew that we lived in a country that was full of many discriminatory measures against Tutsis. Growing up, I grew up with stories from my own parents telling me how they could not go to high school. They had been prevented from going to high school and going to college, not because they didn't do well in school, but simply because of their ethnicity, because of that they were Tutsis in a country that had ethnic quotas at university level, at high school level, where they would annually only allow very, very few Tutsis to go to school. Discrimination was in educational system. It existed in the government and really in every aspect of society. And besides the discriminatory measures, growing up in Rwanda, I was also aware that Rwanda was a country where any time the government, the Hutu-led government, Hutus being the majority ethnic group in Rwanda, that it was a country where any time the government could order the killing of Tutsis, and each time they ordered that killing, the killings would happen. So that while the 1994 genocide was the largest, and for some people it's the only known genocide in Rwanda, it was not the first. Killing of Tutsis go back as far as 1959, the 1960s, the 1970s, and my own parents have gone through and survived an ethnic killings in Rwanda, losing many relatives along the way. But despite this history of killing, we nevertheless, a lot of us were in many ways, you may say, shocked by what happened in 1994. And I think that that was true, particularly for the children, for the young people like myself who had not who had not lived through the prior killings and who grew up only hearing about those killings from our parents, from our grandparents who had gone through them. And growing up in Rwanda, we were aware of that history, but at the same time, I remember that my parents always, and a lot of other Tutsi parents, always tried to protect their children from the history of Rwanda, from living in fear that anytime they may be killed. So growing up in Rwanda, my parents encouraged us to work hard. They put us in school. And they told us that if we worked hard enough, maybe we'll be among the few Tutsis who are allowed to go to high school and eventually to university and so forth. So they always give us, tried to tell us to be courageous and to keep on. And I think that they also hoped that what they had experienced in 50s and 60s and 70s, that will never be happen again. I was born in a family of 7. My parents had 7 children. I had 4 brothers and 2 sisters. I had many aunts, many cousins. In Rwanda, most people have a minimum 4 or 5 children. So growing up, I remember that I was never alone. I went to school, and like any other child, I had goals and dreams of growing up, going to school, and hopefully being able to help my family, to help my parents and my siblings and so forth. But all those goals and dreams and all the plans that we had came to an end beginning on the evening of April 6, 1994, when the Hutu-led government said once again that the time had come for Hutus to quote-unquote do their job. This was a euphemism which was often used in Rwanda to mean killing Hutus, killing their Tutsi neighbors. And starting on the evening of April 6, 1994, the killings of Tutsis and any Hutus who sympathized with them began initially in the capital city of Kigali and on an hourly, daily basis spreading throughout the country. But I have to say that although the genocide officially began in April 6 of 1994, it's important for us to realize that this is a genocide that was planned very well in advance before it happened. That's why in the end, although it lasted for approximately 100 days, it's estimated that over 1 million people lost their lives. So the killings were very efficient because we now have reports that speak about machines being ported to Rwanda by the government as early as 1990. The dehumanization campaign of Tutsis began in 1990. Some of the prominent Tutsis were even targeted and had been killed, as I said, between 1990 and 1994. And men had been trained, civilians had been trained for this genocide that the government knew that he was planning. So when the government finally gave the permission to start killing, it was neighbors against neighbors. Most of the killings in Rwanda were not carried out by government officials per se. There were killings that were carried out by government officials, but most of the killings were done by civilians against civilians, by neighbors against neighbors. And because, as I said, we grew up in an environment where you knew who you were and you knew who your neighbor was, when the government said kill Tutsis, there was no confusion about what the Tutsi in general. So the houses began, the Hutus started attacking their Tutsi neighbors, and as I said, the killings were very efficient, with tens of thousands of people being killed on a daily basis. When the genocide began, I was visiting my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who lived a couple hours away from my parents' village in a neighboring province. And because one of the first things that the government did in order to prevent Tutsis from leaving the country or really from going anywhere was ask the roadblocks be placed throughout Rwanda. So starting on April 1994, the government said that at that point, anybody who attempted to go anywhere, you had to carry your identity card. And what that meant was that Rwanda became a country where it became an environment where it was not safe, really for Tutsis to go anywhere, especially to try and leave the country. So the government, as I said, planned this very well. They made sure the country would be closed to the outside, that all the borders would be blocked off. And whenever you pass a roadblock and you're identified as a Tutsi, you were immediately killed. So because of that, I could not travel back to my parents' village. And my father or my older brother who used to come and get me, they could no longer do that. So I remained with my grandmother until the killings began in her village. And when the killings began in our village, when our two neighbors picked up machetes and started killing, we decided to flee initially to a county office where we thought that we would be protected. At that point, there were really very few options in terms of seeking refuge. As I said, Rwanda was close to the outside world, so even those who had the means to flee to Uganda, to Burundi, like they had done during the previous killings, they could no longer do that. In 1984, the government said that this was going to be it. This was going to be the final extermination of Rwandan Tutsis. So my grandmother and I decided to flee to this county office along with other Tutsis from my grandmother's village. And when we got there, we met hundreds of other Tutsis from nearby villages. So at the end of the day, we had at least 2,000, 2,500 people, men, women, and children, who were seeking refuge. Other people at that point were running away to churches. That was another place that people believed that they would be safe. Only after the genocide, of course, would we learn that those people had ended up being killed in those churches. And in most of the cases, with the help of the priests and the nuns who had invited them to hide only after they had entered, only to go and bring the killers to them. But when the genocide began, nobody could comprehend that such thing would happen. So masses of people fled to churches. We fled to that county office because we hoped that our local officials would protect us. It was more or less a desperate measure because we had nowhere else to go. And people kept reasoning, saying that they had not done anything wrong. People said, these officials, we had elected them just as our two counterparts had elected them, and we couldn't really imagine or we hoped that they would not watch as our neighbors killed us. But it was only a few days after we got to that county office that the attacks began. The county office was attacked initially at night, and then later on during the day as well. Mobs of Hutu men and young men, young people, sometimes as young as 12, as 11, would come with machetes in mobs screaming that Tutsis were cockroaches, that Tutsis were snakes, that Tutsis deserved to die. That was the type of message that was uttered 24/7 on Radio Rwanda during the genocide, the national radio every day. The Hutu extremists came on radio and encouraged Hutu civilians who had not already done so to pick up their machetes. They said that Tutsis were enemies of Rwanda, the Tutsis were cockroaches, and they told them that they deserved to die. At the county office, the killings began. Many people were killed. Even before my grandmother and I were able to escape, we witnessed several massacres of men, women, and children indiscriminately. But my grandmother and I were lucky in that we managed to escape to leave the county office before we were killed. And that was because one of my uncles, one of my mom's brothers, who was a doctor in one of the cities of Rwanda, was informed that we were there and that the killings had begun and that people were being killed every night, every day, and that was a matter of time before we would be killed ourselves. But he was fortunate in that he found a Hutu man who agreed to come in the middle of the night with an ambulance from the hospital where my uncle worked and to try and get us out and take us to where my uncle was at that time hiding. So this man came and he packed my grandmother and I in an ambulance, and we left the county office to a different province where my uncle was then hiding. And when we got to where my uncle was, he was fortunate again in that he found there was a Hutu family that agreed to hide my grandmother and I. My uncle paid them, and they said that they would try to hide us, but they could not hide him, so he had to go and try and find somewhere else to be. And all this time, I had no information about what was going on in my parents' village. I had no information about the whereabouts of my parents, of my 6 siblings, of my aunts, and most of my relatives from my father's side. But I remember that I always, prayed every night. I always hoped that somebody was hiding them. I always hoped that one of our neighbors, whose kids I grew up playing with, going to school with, people who used to come to our homes for food, that one of them would be kind enough to hide them. So the idea that my parents would be killed is something that really never occurred to me during the entire period of the genocide. And I think that having that hope that they will be alive and that at the end of the genocide, when it would end, I'll be able to see them was definitely something that helped me to keep going. My grandmother and I remained with our Hutu family for about a week until we were discovered. So one morning, my grandmother and I were woken up with loud banging and screaming outside the house where we had been hiding. And within a matter of minutes, my grandmother and I had a group of about 7 men. Men who were armed with machetes, bloody machetes, who began screaming and pushing us and screaming at the Hutu man who was hiding us, asking him why it is that he had these cockroaches in his house. Didn't he know that Tutsis deserved to die? Why did he have these cockroaches in his house? And the man who was hiding us kept pleading on our behalf, saying, how can you say that these people are the enemy of the country? This is an old woman, she's in her 60s, referring to my grandmother. This is a child, she might as well be a child. How can you say that these people are the enemy of the country? But they say it did not matter the age, it did not matter the sex. All Tutsis were snakes, and they deserved to die. As I said, this was the message that they were hearing 24/7 on the national radio. At that point, my grandmother and I thought that we were going to be killed. And to this day, when I look back at that moment, I find no reason, no logical reason as to why we survived. It was not because she was old and I was young. Because at the end of the day, in a genocide, nobody was spared. The government said, even in cases of pregnant women, they encouraged to make sure. They told the Hutu neighbors that whenever they found a Tutsi woman who was pregnant, to make sure that even the fetus was destroyed. So the goal in 1994 was extermination, and for those of us who survived, as I said, when we look back, it doesn't make sense sometimes how it is that we did survive. But for one reason or another, the men who had come to kill us left us that day. And after they left, the Hutu men who was hiding us began telling my grandmother and I that we will have to leave. We'll have to leave his house. He could no longer hide us. For 2 reasons. One, because the people who had come to kill us may come back. They may send other people. And also because at this point, once we had been discovered in his house, it was too risky for him and his family to continue to hide us. Because during the genocide, in order to discourage any Hutus who attempted to hide their Tutsi neighbors, their Tutsi friends, from doing so, the government said that Hutus who were discovered hiding Tutsis were considered traitors, and as traitors, they were to be killed as well. So these men told us we had to go. At that point, we didn't really know where we would go. At that point, we were also in a province that we were not familiar with, far away from my grandmother's village. But later on, the Hutu man who was hiding us told my grandmother that there was an orphanage that was nearby, not too far from his house. It was an orphanage that was owned by Italian priests. It's an orphanage that had existed in Rwanda prior to the genocide, where these 2 Italian priests had come to Rwanda and used to care for children whose parents had died of natural causes, of malaria, of all kinds of things. But once the genocide began, these 2 priests were among the very few foreigners who decided to stay in Rwanda and to try and protect the children that they had. And also once the genocide began accepting children whose parents who had been killed. But the Italian priests believed that it was too risky for them to try and hide children, to hide anybody, but especially adults. So because of that, no adult was allowed in the orphanage, and because of that, my grandmother would not be allowed in the orphanage. So at the end of the day, she made the decision to send me to the orphanage, although she knew that she would not be allowed, but she knew that at that point, if anywhere, I had more chances of surviving in the orphanage than anywhere else. So she had the Hutumen who was hiding us take me and told me that she would be fine, that she would find somebody else to hide her, and that the genocide would be over soon. This is something, I remember that during the genocide, every day, every hour, we used to tell ourselves that there is no way this thing is going to continue. We used to tell ourselves either our own government is going to come to its senses and realize the evil that it's committing, or certainly an outside country is going to hear about what's going on in Rwanda. And once they heard, we believed that they will come and they will help us. So when my grandmother said, see you in a few days, I believed it, and she wanted to believe it. And a lot of us every day believed, those of us who lived to see another day believed that and hoped that the genocide would end that day. But after I went to the orphanage, that ended up being the last time that I would ever see my grandmother, because after that I could no longer communicate with her. And I remained in the orphanage, not knowing where she was or whether she was alive, but always praying that she was alive and that she was being hidden somewhere by someone. It is in that Italian priest's owned orphanage that I ultimately survived alongside other children who came there during the genocide. I remember how many times we used to watch as children came inside the orphanage whose arms had been hacked off, whose legs had been hacked off, children who were traumatized from having seen their parents being killed a few minutes before, in most cases by their own neighbors, by people who they used to go to church with, used to go to school with. And as the genocide continued, there came a time when even the orphanage was no longer a safe haven. So there were many nights when all of us were woken up in the middle of the nights and were told that we were going to be killed. There were many times when government would send soldiers, and sometimes when the Hutus in the area of the orphanage came inside the orphanage and told the Italian priests that they were going to kill every Tutsi child in the orphanage. And each time they threatened, and of course the priests used all kinds of means to appease them, bribing them, giving them all the money that they had to run the orphanage. I remember that at the end of the genocide, we really no longer had enough to eat because everything had been given away to try and save us. But nevertheless, the two Italian priests remained in Rwanda and they kept fighting on our behalf. And for one reason or another, we ended up surviving the many attempts on our lives. The genocide ended, as some of you may know, as I said, after approximately 100 days of killings. The genocide was brought to an end by a group known as RPF, or Rwandan Patriot Front. This was a rebel group that was made up mostly of the children of Tutsis who had fled Rwanda during the earlier massacres that I mentioned in 59, in the 60s, in the 70s. So that while the genocide of Tutsis was going on in Rwanda in 1994, there was also a civil war going on between the Hutu regime that was carrying out the genocide and the RPF that had invaded the country from Uganda, and that was at that point trying to stop the genocide. And fortunately for us, the RPF won the war, and they are the ones that brought the genocide after approximately 100 days of killings. And when the genocide ended, of course, all of us who had been fortunate to survive, the first things that we started, the first thing we try to do was to try and find our relatives, the whereabouts of our relatives, if anybody has survived. And for me, I knew that, I hoped that my grandmother had survived. So there were many days and mornings I used to station myself and get to the orphanage, hoping that the next relative, the next person who entered the orphanage looking for a child was going to be my own relative. I knew that even if my parents had survived, it would probably have taken them a long time to find me. After all, we lived in a country, a third world country, where information was even today still passed by word of mouth. So if somebody saw me at the orphanage and told them that if they had survived, that would be the only way they would have known. Otherwise, it would have taken them a long time. But my grandmother, having sent me there, she would have known that I was there. I also knew that if my uncle, who I referred to earlier, had survived, that we would have gone back to the Hutu family that he had left my grandmother and I with, and they would have told him that I was at the orphanage. So my uncle and my grandmother are really the two people that I often hope to see in the aftermath of the genocide. And one day, I was very fortunate in that somebody did come for me. As it turns out, my uncle had survived. My grandmother had not survived, and at the end of the genocide, I learned that she had been killed at a roadblock, not too far from where she and I had been hiding. So after I left for the orphanage, the Hutu family that had been hiding us dismissed her. And as she left in her search to try and find another place to hide, she was killed at a roadblock only a few days after she sent me to the orphanage. But my uncle had survived. He had found a Hutu family that agreed to hide him and his friends, and they dug a hole in one of the rooms of their house, and there my uncle had survived. And after the genocide, he had gone back to the family, and they had told him that I was at the orphanage, after which he sent one of my cousins who had also survived to come and get me out of the orphanage. So my cousin came to the orphanage, she got me out. I was soon reunited with my uncle. And the first thing that I began asking my uncle when I saw him was, of course, first whether he had any news of my grandmother. And he told me that she had been killed. And secondly, whether he had gone back to my parents' village. When was he going to take me back to my parents' village? When was I going to see my parents and my siblings? And when I asked my uncle that, he broke down and he started crying. And soon after that, I'll come to learn that my uncle had indeed gone back to my parents' village after the genocide to see if my mother, his sister, and all her kids and everyone had survived. And when he went there, he found out that two of my aunts, two of my father's sisters, had survived. And they are the ones who ultimately told him about what had happened to my family. And they told him that one day during the genocide, my Hutu neighbors, people who, as I said, used to come to our homes, people whose kids I grew up playing with, going to school with, going to church with, that these people had come to my house during the genocide and they had taken my parents and my 6 siblings and most of my aunts, uncles, the other Tutsis in the village, had hoarded them and taken them to a nearby river where they had proceeded to butcher them with machetes. And the first time that I was told this, I refused to believe it. For a long time after the genocide, I refused to believe that this was true. And I couldn't really understand. All of us who survived had a very difficult time in the aftermath of the genocide trying to digest what had happened in those 100 days. We couldn't understand how it is that, yes, before the genocide, as I said, we were aware of the discriminatory measures facing Tutsis that none of us had ever imagined that what happened in 1994 would happen. We couldn't understand how our own neighbors had killed our families. And I think that was especially the children who couldn't really understand how it is that people had been murdered, not because of anything that they had done, but simply because of their ethnicity, simply because of who they were. And the period of the genocide was a difficult one, as all of us try to digest what had happened. But I was one of the, as you heard earlier in my bio, I was one of the lucky genocide orphans in that I had another uncle who lived in the US and who, after finding out that I had survived, he decided to adopt me and to bring me here. So in 1995, the end of 1995, I found myself coming here. My uncle was then living in Virginia. I came here, it was my first time in the US. I didn't speak English. In Rwanda, the native language is Kinyarwanda. And growing up, we were taught French because of the Belgian influence. But I came here and I met with my uncle and I started trying to adapt to my new life. And the first few years had its own challenges, as you can imagine. First, as I tried to deal with what had happened in Rwanda, I've also tried to adapt to the new environment. And for a long time after the genocide, I didn't really speak about what had happened in Rwanda. I remember that going through elementary school and junior high school, I really didn't speak much about it. And I think mostly because I myself was still struggling to understand what had happened in Rwanda, to understand why it is that my family and over a million people had been murdered in the way that they had been murdered. But as you heard, when I was in high school, when I was a sophomore in a high school in Queens Village, Martin Van Buren High School, I had the opportunity of listening to David, who you will hear from shortly. David came to my class and spoke to my classmates. It was after we had read a book called Night by Ellen Zell. And my teacher invited David to come and speak to us about his experience as a child during the Holocaust. And I remember that besides being one of the classmates who were crying, as David described his experience as a child during the Holocaust, I personally began seeing some similarities between what had happened to him and what had happened to me. Most important of which was the fact that he also had been a child at one time, had friends, had family, belonged in this club and that club, had goals and dreams, but that he, like myself, at one point all those things had been taken away. His family had been killed. He had lived through horrors that no human being should ever have to live through, not because of anything that he had done, but simply because of who he was. And after David spoke, I wrote him a letter in which I briefly talked about my own experience in Rwanda. And as Anne said, I decided to join him and to begin sharing my experience, because I found that, especially among my generation, I found that there was very little information about what had happened in Rwanda. I found that out of my classmates in high school, even in college, knew very little about what had happened. And I felt, as I said in the beginning, that as a survivor, I had this responsibility to share my story, this responsibility to talk about the type of death that my family and many others had killed, the type of death that they had died, and in hopes of preventing what happened in Rwanda from ever happening again, either there or elsewhere. So for the past, it's been now almost 8 years, I think, that we've been speaking at different schools where we've been invited, and synagogues and churches and different conferences, and trying to share our experiences. And because at the end of the day, David and I believe, and this is, despite what we went through, despite what we see today in places like Darfur, we still believe that genocide is a crime that can be prevented. It's a crime that can be prevented because, as we all know, it's not something that happens overnight. And we do believe that awareness and education is one of the best weapons that we have to prevent genocide. We believe that if we can educate, particularly our young people, about the dangers of hatred, about the dangers of racism, of anti-Semitism, of discrimination, and if we can teach them about the value and the importance of tolerance and respect for human life in this country, in the world as a whole, then hopefully we are creating a better generation, we're creating a better future for ourselves and for our children and for the people who come after them. So we as I said, is really this message that we always try to carry with us, and we try to encourage those that we speak to get active in any way that they can with the different organizations. As Anne said, my work during the past 2 years, in addition to speaking, I have been working with an organization called Miracle Corners of the World, and with our organization we put on different education programs every year in different classrooms, and also we try to work with Holocaust and genocide prevention centers. We're also trying to work in Rwanda and try to participate in rebuilding efforts that's going on there, because as you will maybe hear later from Anne, although the genocide ended 15 years ago, the consequence of that genocide is still something that is felt on a daily basis in the lives of many Rwandans. So one of the things that Miracle Corners of the World has been doing is try to participate in the rebuilding efforts. And there are plenty of other organizations that are doing work in Rwanda, doing work, as you're all aware, in speaking out about genocide prevention. So our hope is that when we speak to people, we encourage them to get involved, not just to listen to our horrific stories and be sad about it, but hopefully become active and encourage your own neighbors to be active, so that hopefully, as I said, one day we can live in a world where nobody has to be persecuted and where nobody has to be killed simply because of his race, his religion, or his ethnicity. So thank you so much for your attention. And